With the current state of affairs, one doesn't have to look far before they see evidence of an obvious political divide. From the pandemic, to the economy, to gun control, and more recently, abortion, it has ostensibly become the case where any common ground between opposing sides is rapidly dwindling. You don't need to be an expert to observe that the divide is widening at an astonishing rate, and has been for quite some time. The last 2.5 years especially, but this conclusion was apparent well before then too. Even so, why has the situation deteriorated to such an extent where people cannot simply agree to disagree anymore? What has caused people to simply hate another person for possessing divergent opinions across various issues? In order to answer these questions, we must examine politics and how the concept is inexorably linked with an individual's normative values. People don't exist in a vacuum, and since we have to interact with others by learning to live alongside them, there has to be a medium where we can balance competing interests and viewpoints. However, what happens when that medium fails to complete this task? A state of decay is more than likely to follow, and in some sense, this has already occurred under the contemporary political system. If the trajectory is a downward one, then perhaps we're witnessing the beginning of that downfall. Time will tell, but in the meantime, it's necessary to take a step back and evaluate how we arrived here. Before we attempt to explain the contemporary political divide, what is politics, and what are its notable characteristics? The Cambridge Dictionary presents a few definitions of politics. One reads, quote, "The activities of the government, members of lawmaking organizations, or people who try to influence the way a country is governed." End quote. Another definition remarks, quote, "someone's opinions about how a country should be governed." End quote. Meanwhile, a third defines politics as, quote, "the relationships within a group or organization that allow particular people to have power over others." End quote. As these definitions illustrate, there's some nuance with how politics is perceived. The first pertains to governments, the second to an individual's beliefs about their society, and the third relates to the exercise of power. Power, in the sense of exercising control or influence, is a crucial term that shouldn't be taken for granted. A few years ago, I was enrolled in an undergraduate politics course where I recall my professor asking the class a very simple question: how would you define politics? Put differently, what is politics all about? Various students presented their answers in divergent fashions, but they more or less touched upon some dimension of politics. As valid as those answers were, my professor responded that fundamentally, politics is the study of power, and how that power is distributed and exercised in a given society. His remarks sounded very postmodern, and were likely inspired to some degree by Michel Foucault's philosophy, with his heavy focus on the influence of power. Whether you agree with Foucault's ideas or not, the evident observation is that politics necessitates power, and it wouldn't carry as much influence had it lacked this key characteristic. This discussion will primarily concentrate on the latter two above-mentioned definitions of politics that concern individual beliefs and how power is exercised over others, respectively. Attending first to the matter of personal beliefs, one's politics is inherently a reflection of their normative values. Their political values are a macro version of their micro inclinations. For example, if a person retains values that lean heavily towards self-sufficiency and minimal interdependence, then they are likely to have political beliefs which reflect those inclinations. Conversely, if a person retains values that prioritize cooperation as necessary and acknowledge self-sufficiency as not always being feasible or desirable, then their political views will also reflect that. These examples are heavily oversimplified and the conclusions don't always follow, as the opposites could be true, but you get the idea. Political beliefs are essentially an individual's personal ideals projected on a larger, often societal scale. This thought process essentially remarks that I possess specific values on how I should live my life, and, furthermore, if I aspire to create a better world for those around me, then I'm more than likely to project these normative values onto society itself. This natural instinct has persisted for quite some time because problems have always existed. We don't live in a perfect world. As such, there are problems and issues that must be addressed. These conundrums may possess a similar rhythm, but this doesn't suggest that they perpetually rhyme. What solves one problem may exacerbate another, and so we're left in a situation where differing normative values exist. Additionally, they exist not only in terms of attempting to effectively solve a problem, but also how to prevent an issue from arising in the first place. Gazing upon the present, one cannot help but think, the past occurred in this manner, the present is ongoing, but the future can be changed, so how can I alter it? How can I create the future I desire which ultimately reflects my normative values? How indeed, and extending this vision where it involves others on a broad scale comprises politics. This observation intertwines with politics as the exercise and influence of power over others. It's one thing to exert power over oneself, to make decisions that not only impact yourself, but it is certainly another issue when one exerts power over others. Some decisions are evidently not as consequential as others. Take, for example, a government placing a random holiday on the calendar, compared to drafting legislation that severely curtails rights and freedoms. The former will likely involve less concern and outrage compared to the latter. Why is that? The reason is because decisions that have a monumental impact on how we exercise our normative values will always cause offense. We have a specific vision for how we should live, how our world should be, and when someone or something interferes with that vision, then it will undoubtedly elicit a response that has an overwhelming proclivity to be antagonistic in nature. So, how can this understanding of politics help explain the contemporary political divide? Well, if we comprehend politics as a reflection of one's normative values, and that they're projected on a broad scale, then we can see how this impacts the present situation. A recurrent thought in my mind whenever I see tensions reignite is this. Everyone has a specific version of justice they wish to see through. See through in the sense that they should be able to fully manifest it in practice, to the best of their ability with detrimental consequences for themselves eliminated, or in the very least minimized. Of course, this isn't always possible due to the constraints that exist, like other autonomous beings, laws, traditions, and institutions, etc. Even so, this normative version of justice is a reflection of their values put into practice. Fundamentally, it remarks that I should be able to make these decisions, I should be able to live my life in this manner, and I should have a certain level of power, strength, might, and ability to do so, with as little constraint as possible, otherwise denoted as freedom from constraint, or negative freedom. Building off this conclusion, the emotional responses we are witnessing towards a myriad of politically charged issues stems from certain individuals wanting to see their version of justice through. The stark divide is a result of two contrasting normative visions colliding, and it seems that neither is willing to budge. For a significant segment on both sides of a given issue, compromise doesn't exist within their vocabulary, and this is a dangerous prospect. Not only that, blindness to a given ideology and subsequent demonization, in some cases dehumanization, of opposition further expands the gap. It appears that as time goes on, we have forgotten how to compromise and act in good faith. Instead of interacting with others and integrating them into the common fold, we are isolating them. It isn't difficult to realize that the situation is bleak and it won't improve without a serious rethinking of conduct. The sinister component of this political divide, primarily driven by ideological fanaticism, is the pursuit of a certain normative justice that is hell-bent on manifesting itself. Opposition to this pursuit is not merely denoted as a stumbling block, but a significant obstacle that should be stamped out. What drives this feeling? Revenge, resentment, anger, selfishness, greed, malevolence, pride? Perhaps all of these traits are involved, and part of this phenomenon could likely be explained by the perpetual human desire to conquer and subdue. Throughout history, as demonstrated on numerous occasions in extremely brutal ways, it was simply not enough to defeat opposition. A destructive tendency led certain people to utterly humiliate opposition, demonize them, and then ultimately destroy them. It appears that for some individuals, the presence of opposition offends to such an extent that they will do anything to get rid of them, given the opportunity. Since this isn't always possible, the next best option for these psychopathic individuals is to humiliate them, often through character assassination to the extent of significant alienation. Furthermore, it's almost as if they ask, how dare anyone oppose me and my ideals, my vision for the world? Furthermore, since you have drawn my ire and hurt my ego, now I will cause you harm and get retribution for this grievous offense. This dangerous line of thinking more than likely exists within many people, and it's ostensibly becoming exacerbated. Motivated by extreme selfishness and disregard for fellow individuals, I don't foresee anyone being able to effectively reason with them, especially if the only language they communicate in is that of violence. With the situation looking rather grim, does this mean all hope is lost? Not necessarily. Just like how human malevolence has been a long-standing motif in history, so has human benevolence and resiliency. There has been no shortage of events and time frames where no ostensibly sane person should retain hope, yet they persisted, nonetheless. Humanity has recovered from some immensely bleak events, to put it mildly, and this demonstrates the resiliency of human spirit. Holding on to a flicker of hope in the darkest moments is enough to overcome them. Evil and chaos won't have the final say, as this too shall pass. The question is a matter of when, not if, and in the meantime all we can do as individuals is to continue pursuing truth. Acting uprightly and honestly in our interactions will serve to fulfill this objective. If the crevice continues to widen, then don't further contribute to the problem by chiseling away at the rocks. Seek instead to bridge the gap and contribute positively to the world. If you cannot make the situation better, then avoid exacerbating an already detrimental situation. Easier said than done, surely, but who said bridging the divide was easy? A difficult venture indeed, but it's feasible with enough persistence and good faith attempts to understand.